Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Jane Pickering. I'm the Executive Director of the Harvard Museums of Science and Culture, which includes the Harvard Museum of Natural History, the sponsor of this evening's event, together with the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies. And we are delighted to have Brian Farrell with us this evening to talk about the amazing collection of beetles made by David Rockefeller, which is now housed in Harvard's Museum of Comparative Zoology. And I'd also like to mention that Eileen Rockefeller-Grold and Abby Rockefeller, his daughters, are both here this evening. So I think we'll thank you for being here this evening. So this program is being live streamed on Facebook, so welcome to our online audience. And I do give you permission for the next minute to text anyone and tell them to watch on Facebook if they weren't able to come this evening, but you knew they wanted to participate and hear Brian. So after the program, we invite you to a reception in the museum galleries where you'll be able to see some of the collections that we've brought out especially for you to have a look at this evening. So I hope you will join us. There'll be someone at the door who can direct you up to the galleries if you don't know where they are already. And I have a little bit of sad news, which is that we were hoping that Ed Wilson was going to introduce Brian this evening. Unfortunately, his flight from Chicago has been delayed, so we hope to see him, but I'm afraid I have to introduce Brian, which I will do my very best, but I realize it's not the same, so, so I'm sorry, but maybe we'll see Ed. The weather is not great, as we know, so let me introduce Brian. So he is Professor of Organismic and Evolutionary Biology and Curator in Entomology at the Museum of Comparative Zoology here in Harvard. And he is also Director of the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies. He studies the interactions between insects and plants, and his research has shown that the associations between these organisms, which began millions of years ago and continue to this day, have resulted in the evolution of a formidable number of insect and plant species, which today represent some of the most diverse and abundant organisms on Earth. His lab has many research projects related to insect diversity and evolution, including the study of beetles and mosquitoes around the world. Not sure the mosquitoes is great, but anyway, someone has to study them, I guess. His students are also studying the acoustic signals produced by insects for mating and territory defense. And this research is being used to understand the evolution of music, our very own acoustic signal. For over 20 years, he has spearheaded initiatives to digitize scientific specimens in museums to make them widely available via the internet. And he is involved in many educational projects that use these images to better understand the insect world. He is the author of many dozens of scientific papers and book chapters on the evolution of ecological interactions of insects in the tropics and temperate zones. And he has been the recipient of many, many awards, honors, and grants. So I could go on for a long time, but I don't want to because I really want, as you do, to bring Brian Farrell up onto the stage. Please welcome him with me.
Thank you, Jane, very much for those kind words. I've been thinking about this talk for quite a long time. Made this poster 9 years ago. Been talking with David Rockefeller for 20 years. I've known his family for 40 years. In fact, I'll tell you the story of how we met. I'm from Shelburne, Vermont, a small hamlet on Lake Champlain, about 3.5 hours north of here. And when I was an undergraduate at the University of Vermont, a very good friend of mine named Helen Lowe introduced me to the other person that she knew who liked beetles, Eileen Rockefeller, who was living in Shelburne on Shelburne Farms, where Helen was starting their environmental studies program for education. So we met then 40 years ago, and 20 years ago or so, Eileen and Paul Grold, her spouse, who's also interested in insects, called me up here and asked if I remembered meeting And I did, of course, and it really was, she asked if I could meet with them and a group of potential benefactors for a butterfly museum they were conceiving of in San Francisco. So I agreed, of course, and when we met, it occurred to me that as a curator, I'd become aware of a David Rockefeller who had a very large beetle collection. I realized that must be her father. I'm a little slow, but so I asked Eileen, do you know what your father intends for his collection one day? And she didn't, so I said, would you mind if I wrote him a letter? And so she said yes, and I did, and I handed Eileen the letter that day, and she then handed it to David, their father, a few days later at Thanksgiving. David called me the next day to say, well, what would Harvard want with my collection? And of course, I spent the next 20 years telling him. It's an extraordinary collection, as you'll see, and I'm delighted that it arose. It came to us last week. I drove down to David's home on Wednesday, spent Thursday supervising the packing and shipping. 2 great moving vans filled with cabinets and 150,000 specimens in 440 drawers. 30 cabinets worth made their way to Cambridge. We finished the installation this morning, and here I am to tell you about it. I've had a little bit of time to work on this talk, but if there's any bumps, you know why. So let's see, let me get myself started here. So these are some of the images from across his beetle collection. And quite coincidentally, when we met in 1998, it was just a few months after I'd published a paper with my own research results on answering the question why there might be so many beetles on the planet. So quite coincidentally, I also happen to have had a mounted exhibit in this very museum on beetle diversity. And so when David arrived, we were able to walk around the public galleries and look at these 40 or 50 drawers of beetles that were mounted as a display. And I was instantly impressed and astonished by his very detailed knowledge. Not only did he know every family, he knew the genera and the species across all of beetledom. It was really extraordinary. So I thought, this is really something amazing. So at any rate, we exchanged visits. I visited him again at his home a little bit later on. I saw the famous beetle room that I'll show you in a little bit. And most importantly, as I'll also show you, I introduced him to one of my current graduate students, who then helped curate the collection for the next 15 or so years. So I'll tell you that story as we go. The collection is 150,000 specimens, representing over 10,000 species and 40 families. But only a third of the first half of the collection had been databased. So when I met David, he had 75,000 specimens. And my student, Jeff Morse, who I introduced to David, started right away digitizing and curating and imaging the specimens. He got a third of the way through, about 25,000 specimens. So I'm going to show you some numbers, and they're all based on the extrapolation of databasing 1/3 of the first half. And so we might need to triple and then double those estimates, depending on whether that was representative of everything that he has. So the specimens that David and his friends collected, which you might multiply by 3, are principally in these families: the ground beetles and the longhorn beetles, the scarabs, his very favorites, the leaf beetles that I work on, and the weevils, and then the jewel beetles, and then several other families too. So these are the numbers of specimens. They're all in the many thousands, and there are many more. There's 30 other families. This is basically their proportions. And these are the species collected by he and his friends, also in the thousands. But why beetles? And much of what I say I've drawn from the memoirs of David and of his daughter, Eileen, and in conversations as well. Well, David himself explains it this way in his memoirs. He said, maybe I should take a step back and offer more of an explanation as to why this expedition that you'll soon hear about was appealing to me, especially since many people find my lifelong passion for beetles a little eccentric, perhaps. We'll look at that as well. So I first became interested in nature study through a teacher at Lincoln School. And the teacher, Mr. Sperry, spent the summer of 25. David was now 10 years old. Spent at his parents' summer home there in Seal Harbor, Maine, tutoring both David and his brother Winthrop, and started him catching insects. The same summer, he was in a nature study class that was offered. Both things were instrumental. She went on daily hikes and learned all about the interesting creatures that lived all around us. So he says his parents wanted to, of course, encourage this burgeoning interest, and this is a key point as well. And so we went back to New York that fall. They made it possible for him to spend time at the American Museum of Natural History in the Entomology department so he could begin to identify the first specimens he'd collected. So he was collecting all kinds of things at the beginning, as we all do, grasshoppers and flies and crickets and butterflies and stuff. But then he started working, just focusing on beetles, because after all, they have the advantage of these hard outer wings called elytra, which make them easier to preserve than many other insects. And there are also many more kinds of beetles than any other kind of animal. 1 out of 4 animals is a beetle. More than 330,000 species, as he well knew. They can be found almost anywhere in the world, and so even at an early age, that ubiquity appealed to David. So he goes on to say that his weekly visits to the Museum of Natural History brought him into contact with Dr. Lutz, who had recently published the Field Guide to Insects, which had already become the standard text in the field. Lutz was a superb teacher, enjoyed working with young people, and invited him to spend the following summers at the Station for the Study of Insects at Tuxedo Park, New York, which he did. And by that time, he'd become fairly proficient identifying beetles he collected wherever he traveled. He collected them at Yellowstone Park. He collected them up the Nile in Egypt. And he found lots of stuff in lots of different places, but most especially there at Pocantico Hills at the family home, where he'd hang out a sheet in a black light, like we all do, and watch the hundreds of species that would arrive within an hour or so. And he'd add those to his growing collection. But of course, sadly, he noted even then, as was just reported in Science this last week, that the numbers of insects worldwide have declined by 75% by this recent study published in Germany over the last 20 years. Very startling. So this is a note from Eileen, who I've been corresponding with over the last few days. She says that her father started collecting insects, near the summer place in Seal Harbor, and as the youngest of 6, he was kind of neglected by his siblings. Couldn't tag along very well, so he learned about beetles and the like, and they became his friends, as well as the other animals and plants around him, as they have for many of us in the natural sciences. So he once spoke to me quite philosophically about the importance of beetles, and I'll repeat themes from this through the rest of the talk. So he says, beetles teach one about the extraordinary variety and organization of nature. You can go anywhere in the world and find beetles that you can identify. As I travel, I find friends. How is it that nature has provided this extraordinary variety of animals, in this case beetles, that can be found anywhere and that have similarities wherever they are or wherever you go? It shows the orderliness of nature. The world isn't just a conglomerate. In other words, he was seeing what Darwin saw, evolution in action. I find that in itself rewarding, refreshing, and significant. If you know a little bit about nature, you can know a little about things around the world. That was very helpful, Eileen. So this is another letter she sent along a few days later. She said, Dear Brian, as proof of my father's interest in insects from early on, here's a picture of a drawing that he made between the ages of 7 and 12 of several insects. We only just discovered these pictures in the last week. So this is the first time these have been revealed to the public. He never spoke of drawing, so this is a fantastic discovery. This gorgeous, elegant pen and ink drawing of a dragonfly. Exquisite, graceful, remarkable. The salamander. Can you imagine? 8 years old, 9 years old. A plant bug. He captures it perfectly. The poise. Amazing. The land snail, similarly, just a few lines. Like a one-line camel or a one-line dog, right, by Picasso. A butterfly. A beetle. A young grasshopper with a smile. A frog, a cardinal. Remarkable. He never spoke of this, and yet clearly the imprint of his mother and her love for nature and art had an imprint, and his own ability, of course. So this was the magic glasses that he got. Basically, this is what I realized myself when I was young, is that a field guide is something that opens up the world to you. Provides a guide, a new way of seeing things. And so at the time, Frank Lutz's book, The Field Guide to Insects, had just been published, 1921. And it had all of the details that young David would need to be able to establish his interest in insects. So it had an index with all of the different kinds of insects that you could hope to study. something about their habitats and plants, something about how the methods of collecting and preserving insects, and the control of injurious insects, and of course, lots on beetles. Here are some of the very things that, that David used throughout his life to collect beetles. He always had a beetle bottle in his pocket, like this one. This was his. He always had a hand lens as well nearby. And these are the pen, fine quill pen that he would use to write the tiny script underneath the labels. And here's some more beetle bottles, and then his pinning block as well. The price of natural history collection, of course, is eternal vigilance, as a little bit of dermestid damage would show. This, ironically, is the dermestid beetle species, and they leave their own alone, apparently, but they attack everything else. More meat on these guys, I guess. At any rate, and there's young David's labels. Here's Frank Lutz. I think this is a great picture of him at the station for the study of insects, where he entertained David and taught him over those 2 summers. Dr. Lutz invited me to spend the summers of 28 and 29 at this station, which he did. And here's a letter that David wrote that summer of 28, June 27th. Dear Dr. Lutz, I just wanted to let you know that DeVoe and I, his friend, will arrive in the afternoon of the 9th of July. I'm having a wonderful time on our trip. We saw Niagara Falls yesterday. I've collected several insects en route. I hope that you have been able to get some work done with no one to disturb you. We're looking forward to seeing you soon again. I am David. I'm not sure what the I am refers to, the thing before or after, but it's charming. So, and one of the benefits of databasing this collection is you can recover this history written on tiny labels from his collections in Seal Harbor in 1926 up through 1927 at Tuxedo Park, with a couple of side trips to Greece, and then back again to his home in Tarrytown through 28 and then 29 as well, and back and forth between Tuxedo Park and there and Seal Harbor. He's taught himself, as we all do, reading the classics in the family library, which I know this book formerly belonged to his parents, but now it's David Rockefeller's, 1925. So he was 10 years old, already commandeering his family library. Of course, he read the new classics, too. This had just been published. This is the Catalogue of Coleoptera, the famous Lang catalog, which was a listing of all the species in North America. This is David's actual copy with his annotations on every page, with a check mark, every species he's collected, notes about the new genera or see this other paper. So he was very studious and very serious, a student. As Neva said to me last week, his daughter, if he had been born into a different family, one perhaps somewhat less complex, he would surely have been a scientist. He had that kind of a bent. Later on, the Harvard years, of course, David spent first as a freshman in Thayer Hall. He also spent time over at the Phillips Brooks house, as we'll see. But first he met Tom Barber. Tom Barber was the director of the MCZ at the time, a very extraordinary individual, as I'll describe to you in a moment. And his interest in beetles, David's, earned him an invitation to lunch with the famous Dr. Barber. The invitation originated with the president, who learned of David's interest from his parents. And of course, David was, like any freshman would be, utterly intimidated by this meeting with this great man, but nevertheless, bravely, and this is a lesson for any undergraduates in the audience, take those invitations. We're not scary at all. We just love to talk with students, and as did Barber. So at any rate, they spent that morning conversing, and it was quite a harrowing lunch for a freshman, but at least in retrospect, I enjoyed it immensely. Here's Tom Barber taking up the lion's share of the third step here in the MCZ. He was 6'7", 350 pounds, a $1 man from Beverly, Massachusetts, who started the Cienfuegos, the famous botanical gardens in Cuba, helped start the STRI, the Smithsonian Tropical Institute in Panama, and transformed the MCZ from a kind of an old dusty natural history museum into a modern scientific enterprise. Really quite a remarkable individual, knew everybody in the world. And he was he regarded himself as a pretty useful chore man. So in other words, he was humble, and yet he was able to accomplish things. These are some of his pals who we'll meet now in a second, Henry Bigelow, but also especially William Morton Wheeler, the entomologist at the time. Barber was famous for these lunches, of course. He had this, he called it not the cafeteria, because we're not drinking coffee, we're eating. So the eateria. The eateria, he would even occasionally bring up vats of terrapins from the basement to entertain especially distinguished guests. So he had something like several thousands, many thousands of these lunches over the 20-some years that he was director. And at those lunches were the head of the zoology department at Stanford University, the fellow who started the Museum of Zoology at the University of Michigan, Jocelyn Van Tine, and William Popenoe, who started the Zamorano School of Agriculture in Honduras. And everybody else who was anybody attended a lunch by Tom Barber. And of course, he was the museum director, so he wrote reports every year, and including one of the years in which David was there. But that's another story. So my long-term interest in beetles and other insect life, and maybe coming out of this conversation with Barber, led him to be aware of the course offered by William Morton Wheeler, a graduate-level entomology course, which he took his spring semester. So, of course, Wheeler was a great authority. He was Ed Wilson's predecessor, expert on ants, and the course he got an A-, his only A in 4 years at Harvard. That shows you where his heart was, right? Here's William Morton Wheeler himself, just a few years before he passed in the late 30s. So David's earliest textbooks were these: the Manual for the Study of Insects by Comstock, which had just been published, and the College Zoology by Hegner, and this is a page out of that. This was David's copy, which I found in the Beetle room. He was living in Thayer at the time, 1932. So as I say, he got an A-. These are some of the notes from William Morton Wheeler's course, which are preserved in the Harvard archives. So we had them through the 1920s, but not into the 1930s. I was hoping to find an old exam by David Rockefeller that was corrected, as I have found for other individuals who took those courses. But the records don't quite go into the 1930s. But nevertheless, it was pretty clear that Wheeler was not afraid of handing out a D or a C or even failing some of the students. So he was a hardliner, and David got an A-. German was a different matter. My alternative was to pass a reading examination, and to prepare for it, I decided to spend the summer of 1933 in Munich studying German. Now, while I couldn't have translated Goethe by the end of the summer, I did pass the reading exam when I returned to Harvard in the fall. Frau de Freger, his host there, took a great interest in her guests and took us on weekend trips by car to nearby parts of Bavaria. And he came to appreciate the relaxed, fun-loving ways of the Bavarians and acquired a feel for German history and the incredible culture that had produced those marvelous works of art. But at the same time, he saw the new Germany that Hitler was bringing into existence. This was, of course, always at David's side, the Fauna Germanica. This is the volume on beetles. So he did a lot of collecting while he was in Germany, and those records are all present here throughout Bavaria, from around Munich to the hinterlands on these trips, no doubt. So collecting all the way, always a beetle bottle in his pocket. And in fact, if you look at the records of his collecting up till those years, they were the United States and Germany, really, and very little elsewhere. These are, hundreds of specimens, so many hundreds in the Americas and also in Germany. And of course, but most importantly, that trip inspired him to give such an international experience to Harvard undergraduates who couldn't afford the travel. And that's been a transformational gift that has changed the face of the university. Quite remarkable. Out of that summer spent in Germany, at that time, seeing the rise of Hitler. So my predecessor at the Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies, John Coatsworth, asked David once. John was a historian. He didn't quite get beetles, right? So he asked David, he said, David said that he'd been fascinated by beetles since childhood and talked about his experience as a Harvard undergraduate. Did you really have your large beetle collection moved into your dorm room? He stated, Eliot. Yes, I responded. I probed a bit more. I would think that having thousands of dead bugs in one's dorm room might put a bit of a damper on one's social life, I said. And of course, David, you can just hear him saying this. Well, yes, I could see how that could be. Not that it mattered one whit, right? He chose his friends, of course, and they chose him. So the summer following his sophomore year, his good friend Paul Geyer and David took part in an entomological expedition for the Grand Canyon, organized by the American Museum of Natural History. The expedition was led by Lutz, the curator there. and whom he had known since boyhood, of course. The purpose of the expedition was to study the variation of insect species at different altitudes between the bottom of the Grand Canyon and the top of the nearby San Francisco peaks. It was an ecological study, a term little used at the time, which demonstrated that insect species at the bottom of the canyon were common to Mexico, whereas species at the summit of the peaks just a few miles away, but 10,000 feet higher, were indigenous to Alaska. In short, altitude with corresponding temperature changes may be as important as latitude in determining the distribution of insect species, right? So there's a Harvard sophomore, 1933, remarkable. That summer, I understood more clearly than ever before nature's underlying order. Now, what has come to light in the last 10 years is the long lost for decades, the field journal that he and Paul Guyer kept assiduously that entire summer. Really quite remarkable, with, with entries by both David and by Paul, and of course documented by their camera. Now, I wonder if somebody could help me translate this. I think that there's a joke there somewhere. To ding-a-ling from Haecum ermulus. Is that anybody cleverer than I know what that means? We'll figure it out. Here's the field journal he had reprinted and circulated as family gifts that year. This was, what, 8 or 9 years ago, I guess it was. So that's the cover, the summer of 1934. So their undergraduate Beetle trip features photographs of the group, of course. It's Frank Lutz here in the corner, and then there's young David, Paul Guyer, and then a Mr. Bell, who was a general assistant, I think, to the trip, logist, and probably keeping the boys safe as well. This is one of the maps that's in the journal, the San Francisco peaks. You can't read it, but right here in the middle is Mount Agassiz, named for the founder of this museum, the highest peak there. Here's the Agassiz Peak at some 12,000 feet. And Lutz and David went up by way of the road and ridge to have lunch on the summit of Agassiz. And after lunch, Lutz showed him the most effective way of collecting beetles up there. They pulled up small plants by the roots, being careful to take a lot of dirt with it, and they shook them on the flattened beating sheet and found lots of tiny beetles and interesting beetles which live in the roots. So since violent weather makes it difficult for insects to live out in the open on leaves or whatever, that's the best way of getting them. So a great lesson early on. Here's the Grand Canyon collecting area, which you probably can't read, but Bright Angel Canyon and the others. Down in the canyon, Lutz was collecting moths at the door of one of the cliff dwellings. David, of course, photographed these beetles. This is a Leodes. It's a kind of a darkling beetle that is very characteristic of deserts in Mexico and in the southwestern U.S. They basically tip themselves up when they're threatened, and they squirt out some nasty stuff from their butts. So they do this headstand, which is very characteristic of Leodes, the most obvious of desert beetles. They're very well protected. And of course, here's Paul making a plant press and Dr. Lutz supervising. And anybody who's ever camped knows this ritual. One person does the cooking, and the others do the opinionating. So there's Lutz and Bell telling him exactly what he's doing wrong with respect to cooking breakfast. That's Paul Guyer at the stove. So David's also very interested in art, of course, and in artisanry, Indian pots he's collected in baskets, and he visited the makers of those. And this is some of the catch, from the South Rim, from Mount Agassiz, and then from down in the canyon as well, various beetles that are now here. They also documented personal growth of Paul's beard, which had attained their stupendous length of nearly 1/4 inch in 4 weeks. To make such a record, I put on the front lens attached to my Leica and took a close-up of the beard. So humor always at hand. These were close friends. So this is just a schematic of the number of species found in each of the places as they drove out west from Colorado to New Mexico to Arizona. This is the hundreds of species, basically. And these are the numbers. Oh, it's hundreds of specimens and then many tens of species. Lutz always out collecting every place else. So David's interest in entomology while at Harvard led him to another outside activity his first year through the Phillips Brooks House, this organization that we're all very proud of that encourages service learning. He taught a class once a week in nature studies to a group of young teenagers at Lincoln House, a settlement house in South Boston. He took them out to hunt for insects and learn about trees and wildflowers. And one of the boys, Fred Solana, the son of a Spanish stonemason, showed much more interest and aptitude than the others. As a result, he asked Fred to help him with his beetle collection in his room at Elliott.
And for the next 3 years, he employed Fred to catalog and took care of the specimens. After the war, Fred joined the Chase National Bank, where he had a fine career. And then for 25 years, he would visit David's house once a week, got to know David and the kids and the collections very well, as they learned to sit with him and to collect insects and all about them. And as the children have been telling me these amazing stories. And in fact, upstairs we have their insect collections they made as children. Quite remarkable. Here's a photograph of Fred Solana, along with Eileen here in her father's arms, who's in the front row, and then let's see, Abby and Peggy and Neva, and a friend. Now, subsequent the war years, David also continued to collect. He was an intelligence officer stationed in Algiers. Yes, he kept all of his military manuals. I brought a couple of them back with me, as part of the archives. This is a scorebook for the rifle. He also had a field guide to how to walk through a minefield, and really quite remarkable stuff. These are the collections he made throughout Algeria. Lots of different kinds of beetles, Cerambycids and other groups. Carabids, the scarabs, his very favorites, and chrysomelids and other groups too throughout that country and around Algiers itself. David and his spouse Peggy often traveled to Latin America, where they had many friends too. And this is the numbers of species that David himself collected in Brazil and through Mexico and Central America. These are the numbers of specimens he collected in all of the different states of Mexico. And he funded others. As every great collection and collector operates, you basically collect as much as you can, but you only have so many hours in the day. So you help others to collect as well, and you trade and exchange, and so occasionally you'll buy a collection if it comes available. So at any rate, he funded expeditions by the American Museum to collect. And the way those work is that typically whoever sponsors the collection has the honor then of having any new species named for them. So here's a species of Diplotaxis named Rockefelleri after David that was discovered in Mexico. And there's another expedition that resulted in the loss of some of his favorite beetles, the Buprestids, the jewel beetles. This is a description of a new species, Acmeottera Rockefelleri, and a distinction of the characteristics of the characteristic scales, difference between the new species and the most closely related species. And there's that Acmeottera there. So 11 other beetle species are named for David. So all of the specimens across all of this, basically every state of Mexico, number in the many hundreds. And here they are, in everywhere from Chihuahua to Coahuila to, Durango, Colima, basically everywhere. And so I happened to be in Mexico a couple of weeks ago, and I met the son of some of David and Peggy's very best friends from there, Javier Alonso and Angeles Espinosa Iglesias. And their son, Antonio Alonso, who's about my age or maybe a little younger, and I had dinner at a gathering. And I wrote him afterwards, and I asked if he had any stories about David, and he said, yes, I have lots of stories, most of them about how he liked to negotiate everything. So he said, once we went to Zacatecas, and he asked me to take him to a market where he could buy a basket for his collection. So I took him to a nice market, and he told me to take him to the real market where the local people go. So I took him, and you can imagine it was not very nice, very crowded, and not too clean. When we finally saw a basket he loved, he approached the man who was selling them and asked how much was it. And the seller told him 50 pesos, and he started negotiating with him until he got it for 20. And a lot of times, things like this happened everywhere he went. So I thought about that for a day or so, and then I realized, here's a man who could have sent somebody with whatever sum of money was asked to buy the basket for him and bring it back, but he didn't. He chose to approach the man in an interaction, an engagement, in bartering, basically trading back and forth for this basket, and he didn't know the outcome of this negotiation. He won the basket in the end, but that was really David, So he was interested in people, and interested in culture, and interested in making a connection. And I think that was him. And it was a wonderful thing. And I sent back to Jose Antonio my interpretation, and Jose Antonio said, yes, you're absolutely correct. The fact that he wanted to engage different people and have an interaction with them because of his interests, to better understand different cultures, needs, and the idiosyncrasy of everyone. He always wanted to learn more. And that was David in a few words. So he also had many friends in Brazil, of course. He collected himself in different places, but it's a big country. So he actually happened to meet an ex-military man who offered to provide specimens if David would provide a jeep for collecting. So in fact, I found in the beetle room some of the letters from this fellow to Fred Solana that accompanied some of the beetles themselves. There are lists of the specimens he was sending, the box that they were contained in, and a note of apology that he wishes there were more, and there will be next time. So he sent those beetles over quite a long time, and it's an extraordinary collection between the 1940s and the 1960s. So here's the number of species, many hundreds of species from many of the states of Brazil. And many thousands of specimens, of course. Some of the most extraordinary parts of this collection, as you'll see. So David was collecting beetles and memories for many, many years, obviously. These are some of these specimens in his first collections from around Pocantico Hills, around his house. I found this charming little jar, lots of jars with a few beetles in them. This one was, I don't know if you can read it, it's from the Piazza di Spagna in Roma. And apparently he found a beetle, he found whatever jar he could, labeled it, picked up the beetle. There it is inside. It's a beautiful little cycrine, a kind of a carabid that's kind of rare, a little snail hunter, brilliant purple, gorgeous little animal. And it's been there sitting now since 1967 for 50 years. So there it is, remarkable. You know, memories of places he's visited. So if you take all of the specimens that in David's collection, there's some 10,000 or more in many countries, multiply that times 3 and then double it, and you'll get to about 150,000 specimens. We have a long ways to go with respect to databasing. But you could also take another look at it with that database and look at the time and where he was when he was collecting. Some of the earliest specimens were collected by others, but his first big pulses here are in his teen years, and then his Harvard years, the World War II years afterwards. And then Fred Solana passed away, and there was a hiatus. He really kind of stopped collecting in the 80s and the early 90s. And then we met again, and I introduced him to the fellow I'll show you next, Jeff Morse. And between Jeff and I, David got re-inspired to collect beetles, and he started actively collecting, going on expeditions around the world, building up his collection, and then eventually doubling it in size. Really quite remarkable. So these are the places. And this is just a snapshot, because again, we only have a partial record of his. Here's young Jeff. He was a PhD student at the time, very skeptical about this request. You want me to do what? To go down and curate somebody's collection? And I said, believe me, it'll be worth seeing. So Jeff went down and saw the professional collection this was, really world class, quite remarkable, and then spent the next, almost 20 years visiting, a few times a year for an intense long weekend, first on his own, then with his spouse, and then, of course, it kind of petered off once they had children. But nevertheless, we're able to travel and document the collection. This was Jeff's PhD thesis on a particular kind of beetle, the seed beetles, 2003. So David was re-inspired to go beetling around the place in Maine, to go to New Zealand with Jeff and blacklight for beetles, hunting for tiger beetles in Botswana, inspecting the catch. Also visited Brazil, India, Costa Rica, Guatemala, Myanmar, Botswana, and the Adriatic. And of course, if you know David, at that hour, there was a martini at hand. So there he is with a light, shedding light on the catch with James Ford, his company, his assistant, and others, family members on the trips, including the Grolds on several trips. Some of David's favorite beetles were these giant African Goliath beetles that we'll show you at the reception afterwards. So in 2004, our Center for Latin American Studies, we have a journal called Revista. The editor, June Ehrlich, is here in the audience. And June had the inspiration of dedicating this year, our 10th anniversary, we were founded in 1994, towards the theme that was closest to David's heart, the flora and fauna. And so David took some time to write the articles, which are now, of course, online. You can read them on the website with this talk. So he just talks about, his appreciation of the beauty and intricacy of the natural world. Just think of the architecture, the engineering skill, the dogged persistence of a spider weaving a web, or the complex social life of bees and ants. These remarkable qualities reflect the reason I've chosen this issue of Revista, the Harvard Review of Latin America, celebrating the 10th anniversary of the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies, to reflect on my own relationship to flora and fauna, and most particularly beetles. So maybe you'd like to see some beetles at this point. We've been talking about them for so long, right? Well, how about these tiger beetles from David's collection? Remarkable, aren't they? They're jewels. Extraordinary. Tiffany couldn't have made anything as beautiful as these with the gilt, 100 years ago. How about these buprestids with this amazing iridescence? And these are the scales. So these are pretty sizable beetles. More buprestids, another one of his favorite families. More still. Again, buprestidae, the wood-boring jewel beetles. These guys feed as larvae inside the trunks of trees. Some of them mine leaves. The adults feed on pollen. How about these extraordinary weevils from Brazil and Argentina, complete with photonic crystals? That iridescence is produced by a special crystal, which is the same one that's in opals. It basically rearranges photons and creates this kind of iridescence that changes depending on your angle. It's not simple iridescence, it's more complicated than that. Why they do this, who knows? They don't really find each other visually. Anyway, another species that's a little bit more blue in tint, of course. And sometimes they're covered with white scales, or a velvety kind of pubescence that's very much like a leather or suede covering, especially in these scarab beetles. Extraordinary colors sometimes, beautiful matte texture, very different from the iridescence I just showed you. These and many more will be visible in the dozen or so drawers that we have on display in the reception, if you'll join us. Inca clathrata, what an extraordinary name, and an even more extraordinary beetle. Extraordinarily large, too, from Peru, in the Midlands around the Andes. Remarkable insect. Another scarab. And then the long-nosed curculios, which are some of my favorites. The palm weevils, interesting in their biology, and actually pretty tasty, it turns out, too. Their larvae are very fatty. Here's the beetle room. I took this photo last Thursday. I'm afraid I had a few boxes scattered around collecting, the books and the like. The bookshelf is here, and his beetles are over in this corner. He had another room with a microscope set up. There was a microscope set up here as well. And then, of course, beetle art everywhere. What do you give somebody for Christmas if they like beetles? Well, guess what people did for about 90 or 100 years? He had a lot of beetle stuff. Beetle sculptures, beetle everything. Here's the built-in cabinets he had made in the sides of the room. So these drawers you could slide out. Originally, they were small brown wooden boxes. And thanks to Jeff, thank God for Jeff, over 20 years he moved all of the beetles out of these little brown boxes and into drawers that could be fit right into a modern museum cabinet. So by the time we were picking them up, it was a piece of cake. It was very easy to bring them up and slide them right back into the cabinets again so you could study them. They were all moved from, instead of being pinned in the bottom, which was the way you did it for about 80 years, he moved them into modern unit trays so they could be managed. And David was very, very happy with that, and Jeff was instrumental in making this really a state-of-the-art collection. Here's Alice Victor, David's long assistant secretary, personal secretary, opening up one of those beetle drawers. So now we've purchased museum cabinets, and these drawers just slide right into them because they're exactly the right dimensions. So that was all recrafted after Jeff started. Now I was amused to see those early, versions of David's, sort of library tags on the insides of the books. Especially when I saw these, which are produced by extraordinary artists in Chicago. So every book now, I think every book in the house has this on the inside. It's obviously a beetle, and it's produced by this fellow, Tony Fitzpatrick, who is quite a remarkable contemporary artist, I think. So I was very charmed by those. Not formal at all. So what I call this, why this obsession with anything? It happens to be beetles, but it could be. It could be books, it could be a particular artist, it could be butterflies, snails, you name it. I come to call it curiositas. So the intrinsic curiosity that many of us have, this passionate curiosity about the world. What is it about collecting objects that draws us in? Well, I think it's this combination of things. It's a combination of, beauty and interest in the objects. So the objects are beautiful, but they also have deep, almost unfathomable interest, because if they're natural history objects, they have an evolutionary history. You can never know everything about them. They have all of the features that they share with near and far relatives of themselves. They have their habits, the way they make a living in the world. They have the architecture, the form, and the function. They have all of these layers of complexity and depth that themselves have a certain beauty, quite apart from the physical beauty that they have. They also bring, when you're collecting and interested, a growing virtuosity and confidence in yourself, that you understand something about the world, something that's predictable and expectable and comprehensible. And I think that's very reassuring for us all. So I think that's a conversation that we have with the world, and it's through the medium of whatever objects happen to hold our attention. So the reward, of course, is a lifetime of foraging, looking for the things of interest, and the discovery of meaning in everything. And that's really, at the end of the day, all we have in life is meaning, right? So it reminded me of Richard Feynman, believe it or not. So Richard Feynman was also attracted to art and science. And he said, he took art lessons later in life. He said, I have a friend who's an artist, and he's sometimes taken this view, which I don't agree with very well. He'll hold up a flower, and he'll say, see how beautiful it is, and I'll agree. And then he'll say, I, as an artist, I can see how beautiful this is. But you, as a scientist, you take it all apart, and it becomes a dull thing. And I think that he's kind of nutty, says Richard. First of all, the beauty that he sees is available to other people, and to me too, I believe. Although I may be not quite as refined aesthetically as he is, I can appreciate the beauty of a flower, after all. But at the same time, I see much more about the flower than he sees. I can imagine the cells in there, the complicated actions inside, which have beauty at smaller dimensions, the inner structure, and also the processes, the things at 1 centimeter, the fact that the colors in the flower evolved in order to attract insects, to pollinate it. It's interesting. It means that the insects can see the color. It adds a question. Does this aesthetic sense also exist in the lower forms? Why is it aesthetic? All kinds of interesting questions, which the science knowledge only adds to the excitement, the mystery, and the awe of a flower. It only adds. I don't see how it subtracts. And I think that's exactly right. And that's the thing about this collecting of beetles or anything else. It's aesthetic, but it's deeper than that too. It's meaning. So David's thoughts, as remembered by Eileen, are these. The beetles teach one about the extraordinary variety and organization of nature. You can go anywhere in the world and find beetles that you can identify. As I travel, I find friends. How is it that nature has provided this extraordinary variety of animals that can be found anywhere you go? The world isn't just a conglomerate. It has order and structure. I find that rewarding, refreshing, and significant. If you know a little bit about nature, you can know a little bit about things around the world. We live in a world where man is a predominant force, but the fact is that there are vastly more species of beetles than humans. Through beetles, my father found his own sense of family, writes Eileen, of humility. He has kept his eye to the ground, to the little things that really run in life, that really run the world. His interests and perspective have taught me to keep my eyes open, to look with wonder at the natural world, and to treasure beauty and relationships whenever I find them. So David and I weren't alone in our obsession with beetles, of course. Charles Darwin is a famous beetle collector. I feel like an old war horse at the sound of a trumpet when I read about the capture of rare beetles. Is this not the magnanimous simile for a decayed entomologist? It really almost makes me long to begin collecting again. Charles Darwin, his autobiography, 1858. From the small size of insects, we're apt to undervalue their appearance. If we could imagine a male chalcosoma with its polished, bronzed coat of mail and vast, complex horns, magnified to the size of a horse or even a dog, it would be one of the most imposing animals in the world. Charles Darwin, The Descent of Man. I often say, if they were the size of horses, Steve Spielberg wouldn't have had to make the movie, Jurassic Park. Here's Darwin's beetles at Cambridge University. There's a famous story about how he collected one beetle and then another beetle, and he saw a third, so he put one of the beetles in his mouth. It sprayed him, and so he lost 2 of the beetles. He could have had 2. He ended up with 1. But, it also occurred to me that Darwin wrote The Origin of Species. He wrote other books for other reasons. Basically an exploration of his understanding of the world. What would you write about if you had spent many, many months at sea? You'd write about the only arthropods you could see. You'd write about barnacles, right? So barnacles all over the boat, he could appreciate many different forms, many different shapes, all towards the same function. So he wrote this great monograph on the diversity of form in barnacles in order to understand the evolutionary process in transforming a basic body plan, barnacle or beetle, into all these different forms adapted for different ways of life in different places. And so that was his exploration of the fact and the results of evolutionary change that then led to, of course, his theory of a mechanism for evolution. And many others have written from other perspectives about great natural history collections that have been collected assembled over the last century here in the United States, over in Great Britain, or in the colonies as well. And there's some other unexpected beetle collectors. Who knew? Pablo Neruda collected beetles. You know, we know a lot that we know about his mollusk collection, but I've seen his beetle collection in La Chascona, the house named for his wife. She named for the great mane of red hair that she had, the Chascona of hair. And it's a beautiful beetle collection. And he's written in many different places about them. He called himself, in fact, a self called cosista, somebody who collects cosas, things. So he loved the material culture and all of the things that you could learn. So it's the same kind of interplay of beauty and depth of interest. So Pablo Neruda, remarkably enough. Ed Wilson put it well. He said, you know, most children have a bug period, and I never grew out of mine. Thank goodness he didn't, right? And many of us haven't grown out of ours either, David included. So, of course, Ed's famous for having worked on Phydolia and other ants, and William Morton Wheeler before him. My other colleague in the museum here at Natural History shares this same obsession. Hers is for lycaenid butterflies, a passion shared with Vladimir Nabokov, who was here before, working on lycaenid butterflies. And of course, I work on plant-feeding beetles. My predecessor here was P.J. Darlington, who worked on another group of beetles. Even William James, whose name is as associated with Harvard as Ed Wilson's is, was a naturalist at heart. If I followed my taste and did what was most agreeable to me, I'd tell you what I'd do. I'd get a microscope and get out in the woods and make as many discoveries as I could. And I'll be cooked if I wouldn't be more useful than if I laid out railroads by rules which somebody else had made. And I learned. If I'm in the former case, I don't vindicate my existence better than in the latter. Then I'm no man. I'll tell you what I think I'll do. I'll be a farmer, and I'll do as much good in the natural history line as I can. Maybe we're fortunate that, in fact, he decided that he was interested in psychology and philosophy and education instead. But nevertheless, his inclinations were there. Why do we make these collections? Why are there collectors in general? This just came out in the New York Times, an extraordinary, gorgeous book that June Ehrlich told me about on the moths, the mariposas of Central America. Well, now I'm going to make a leap. So I'm going to connect this to health, believe it or not, mental, physical, and otherwise. A few years ago, I'd been thinking about our relationship to nature and why is it that I feel better when I am outdoors. Something my mother noted in a kindergarten report card. Brian is very moody and withdrawn during the winters, but in the summer when he's outdoors at our place on the lake, he becomes a new person and he loves insects and knows the names of many of them. I was 5 years old. Why did I respond to nature that way? Why do I continue? Why do we all continue to respond to nature? Well, a few years ago, I came across this article on this phenomenon which explains why it is that people under life-threatening conditions in hospitals have a much better prognosis if they're surrounded by family and friends than if they're isolated. So these physicians took such individuals, all patients, terminally ill patients in the hospitals, and they administered a questionnaire. How often are you visited? Who are your friends and family? And then they took blood samples from them. And what they discovered was that there's a startling correlation. People who are connected to family and friends have their immune system genes boosted up and the inflammation response lowered. It's absolutely the reverse for the lonely. So the reason that we live longer if we have friends and family around us is that it's good for our health. It boosts all of the things that make us healthier, and it fights the things that actually often do us in, the inflammation response at the end. Quite startling. So that hit me like a ton of bricks because I realized that there might be a much more general effect than that. It might not just be in hospitals, and it might not just be our responses to the people around us. It might be almost everything that touches us inside. But of course, if you can't demonstrate it in a place where you have all the money in the world, in the medical industrial arena, then you probably couldn't demonstrate it anywhere. But we have demonstrated it here. So what about the effect of nature on our health? Maybe it isn't just our response to other humans. Maybe this is the same effect we get when we face nature. We actually also know that in hospitals, rooms with a view, or even with a plant in them, people have a better prognosis than if they don't have a view and they don't have anything green around them. So this is just a compilation. I'm just going to show you a couple of slides with various papers where this is coming from, where this has been studied most intensely in Japan and also in Scandinavia. In Japan, it's called Shinrin-yoku, forest bathing, which is the experience of being in the forest. There's many dimensions of it, but I'll just summarize and say that it has to do with the smells and the sights and the feeling you get from being in the forest. And it could be also snorkeling in the water or anything else that is multidimensional and that is understandable and comprehensible and soothing. So at any rate, there are all of these various effects on our psyche, on our immune systems, on cancer, and the like. In Scandinavia, there's a parallel ancient tradition of life outdoors, and the Scandinavians and the Japanese have gotten together, and even now at the Harvard Medical School, and the School of Public Health, this is being pursued as well. So forest bathing, tripping, there's lots and lots of papers like this, increases human natural killer activity and expression of anti-cancer proteins. And there have been some wonderful papers written by my colleague Julia Africa, who's formerly with the School of Public Health here. Some wonderful summary papers that you might look up if you're interested. And there's some popular literature on this. You know, in a nutshell, take 2 hours in the forest and call me in the morning, better than a visit to the hospital, maybe. And there's been Julia sent me this extraordinary recent compilation of studies on the effects of nature contact and its effects on human health, a research agenda. You can't read this, but these are all the papers that demonstrate reduced stress, better sleep, improved mental health, reduced anxiety, greater happiness, reduced aggression, and on through. Even better eyesight, it turns out. So we know that there is a strong link between our well-being and nature. And this might be part of the reason, part of the benefit of pursuing these kinds of interests. Now, ironically, this is just out this last year in the in the Times. Our natural history museums are under increasing constraints. They're not the most modern institutions around, and so folks are less excited to support them, the state that is. But the public need is clear. Also in the Times last week, did you see this piece? People are decorating these buildings in New York with extraordinary art of nature, mostly birds. It's remarkable. We can't suppress this need to connect with nature, even in a concrete environment. Extraordinary. And of course, if you look on Facebook, there's a zillion groups on identify the moths or the mushrooms. I'm amazed, frankly. I'm amazed that all of these groups exist, and anybody who takes a picture of anything outside, they can post it to this, and then people compete trying to identify it. There's a lot of expertise out there, a lot of citizen scientists. It's really extraordinary. So we're mustering this expertise through citizen scientist participation, through this kind of crowdsourcing of identification of specimens and the like. But it's really very inspiring, I think. So I think it's friends. I think it's nature. I'll bet it's also our passions for music and art and ritual. And all of these responses to these stimuli can be enhanced by what's called in social psychology priming. Priming is an unconscious kind of, the formation of the enhancement of our response. It has a neurological basis, an enhanced response to a stimulus. So this might even include the placebo effect, which of course is bad news for medicine, but great news for the rest of us. It's what William James recognized as the mind cure. So if you really believe, it can really make a difference. It's amazing. So what is priming? It's this unconscious form of human memory concerned with perceptual identification of words and objects, et cetera. It refers to activating particular representations or associations in memory before it. So there's a technical sort of approach to this. If you've just seen the color yellow and then somebody shows you a picture of a banana, the word banana comes to you more rapidly than if you hadn't seen the color yellow beforehand. So that's priming. And there's a fair bit of literature on this. So I'm in favor of self-priming. Basically, train yourselves in these kinds of endeavors, whatever they are. Passions for natural history. As Ed Wilson has written very well, the Letters to a Young Scientist, just encourage, as David's mother did for him, as we do with our children. We all have an inner scientist or an inner artist, an inner cosista, that would respond, I think. And I think we would then reap the benefits of improved health, improved mood, and a positive outlook on the world. I think this is a real, a wonderful hope for the future, optimism. So maybe, as Noam Chomsky said back in the 60s, we have an inner template for language that's, for syntax that's just waiting to be populated by vocabulary. Maybe we actually have an inner template for a response to just about everything, all kinds of culture. That's why we all feel a particular affinity for the smells and the sights of home, for the familiar foods, for the people we grew up with. We're primed early on to respond to those places. And thank goodness it isn't all the same place, right? So we can live in lots of different places and feel equally passionate about the smells of the South or those of the North or the West or wherever it is. I think also that we need the reassurance of the familiar sights, the comprehensibility, the order that David described so well in the world. I think that's comprehensible, it's reassuring, it's predictable in the face of chaos that we're assaulted by in the news every day, for example, or life in cities. I think, moreover, that there's such a thing as educational priming. We all get these boosts I've just acknowledged. You feel better after you've gone to a concert or the museum or for a walk in the woods. And we all get that boost. But maybe if we know a little bit more about what we're seeing and hearing and smelling or feeling, maybe we get a little bigger boost. And if that's true, then education matters to public health. The more you know, the more you benefit from your experiences. It makes sense. But that hasn't really been studied at all. And I think it could be studied in places like universities, high schools, grade schools. The earlier, the better. So as I travel, I find friends. The world isn't just a conglomerate. That's a great perspective, I think, summed up in just a few words. Okay, let's back to the Beetle collection. From Hudson Pines to the MCZ, this was David's home for many, many years. 30 cabinets of beetles being packed up, being loaded aboard the moving vans, being unloaded here at the MCZ and into the modern cabinets, just finishing this morning, as I mentioned. So the Museum of Comparative Zoology holds some 25 million specimens of animal species from around the globe, but within the educational setting of this world-class university. That's a unique configuration. There are other great museums around the world, none of them within such a great university. This is the entomology department. In the entomology department, we have about 7.5 million insects, about half of them beetles. What do we do with all of those beetles and with David's? They're sent on loan to other institutions at the request of scientists who are stationed there or interested in particular groups. They might borrow all the members of a genus or of a subfamily or a tribe of insects. These happens to be the beetles. At the moment, we have over 400 active loans with 80,000 specimens around the world and under study. We get them back with modern identifications. Some of them are recognized as new species. It's always enhancing value of the collection. And that's what an active collection is. It's not just a repository, a static repository of specimens. It's an active scientific enterprise that exchanges with all of the other museums and universities around the world. So those 7.5 million specimens was started in 1859, starting with some very old collections. It's the oldest around. We're second only to the Smithsonian in the number of types. Overall, many regard ours as the most important collection because of its history. The beetles is the most abundant piece of our collection. The Hymenoptera is next. And of the Hymenoptera, the ants, 1 million species, or 1 million specimens, makes us the largest ant collection in the world. We also have the largest fossil insect collection. And so the bits of the beetle collections that you can read about online are these LeConte and Horn collections, have about half of the American species. We have the types of them. Also the Fall collection, the Bowditch collection of chrysomelids, and it'll be added the Rockefeller collection. When I first started here, we started imaging the collection because I thought with a skeleton crew, you only got 3 staff. What can we do that would have an impact? Well, let's image the specimens and put them online so that everybody could have access. Of course, back then it meant Kodachrome 25, and a scanner took forever. So then Nikon had the vision to invent a digital camera. That was in 2000, and we've been digitizing. I got an NSF grant a few years later, and we finished all of the beetle types, 14,000 of them, and we're well underway to imaging the other types as well. Let's see, what do we have now? I guess about 10,000 more to do. So we have partner institutions with which we share that data. those images and the data from the labels as well. And these are facilitated through GBIF, of which we're a member. That's a European institution that connects, nearly 1 billion records of species occurring in particular places, particular times. Those label data that I showed you early on are captured. This history written on tiny labels. David wrote a memoir, but there's another history written on these little labels of every place he went, any particular day, any particular place. And if you digitize that, you can actually reveal that history and share it with other observations of the same species collected by other people at other times. And you can trace those species then through space and time. So you can trace all of the species of Tetropes, for example, across North America through GBIF. These are the records not just from the MCZ, but from all of the other institutions in North America and Europe that have collections of Tetropes all online. The same with Phydoli around the world. The same with the lycaenid butterflies around the world through GBIF. We also have new aids to identification, barcoding, DNA barcoding, able to identify things, at least get it down to genus or pretty close, so then a taxonomist can spend their time, getting the final details out. There are also new aids to understanding the connection between species and their environment. We have the wherewithal to get whole genomes from museum specimens. And there's the promise of a vast online field guide that E.O. Wilson thought up first in 1993, way ahead of us, ahead of the digital revolution, really. Global access to knowledge about life on Earth, putting all that information on images and species occurrences throughout the world in a single access portal that everyone can use. So I'm here also announcing this will be coming next year, the E.O. Wilson Postdoctoral Support Fund at the Museum of Comparative Zoology. We're aiming to raise funds to support this kind of taxonomic research in museums at every level, from the postdoctoral supported by this fund created by Ed to the small fund that David left some funds to as a nucleus for to enable the kind of student research in the Beetle collections that'll complement that of the postdoc. So this will allow undergraduate and graduate students. This is the kind of training opportunities that are needed in museums like this. So building these kinds of connections and bridges really enriches and brings meaning to life, however one pursues it. Let me close and share with you an image of David that we created for his 90th birthday. This was 11 years ago. This is a portrait of David made entirely of images of beetles from his collection. So I sent it down to him. I was in the Dominican Republic at the time in June, and he tracked me down and called me from the birthday party saying this was the most wonderful gift he'd yet received this year. And everybody was talking about it. So I guess he liked it. So the beetles are the dark part here, and these are the labels, of course, and the lichen. And these are the type labels, and there's red tie. So there you can see a close-up. Kind of fun. I've done one since of Ed Wilson out of ants. So that's really all I have to say for you. That's the arc of my talk and of my history with David. And there's much more to be developed as we study his collection. It'll take many decades by many people. But thank you for coming, and please join us for the reception. Thanks. Please. I'd like to, before I take questions, I'd like to call up, yes. Ed is here. I am pleased to welcome Ed Wilson to the stage. Ed, thank you for coming.
I was supposed to introduce wonderful guy, but a mistake in the schedule and slowed arrival of my plane. I just came in from the University of Chicago, and I got too late. So I'm going to instead offer an epilogue and a statement of gratitude to our speaker for making this remarkable addition to the Museum of Comparative Zoology possible, and to do it in a way to enhance the history of science and the history of Harvard generally, and to call public attention, as he's now done tonight so well, to the importance of our collections. So thank you, David. I speak for, I'm sure, I know I speak for the other curators and for all of those who are working in the interest of the museum. And you've turned your other major activity in leading the David Rockefeller program for Latin American studies, you've turned it into gold by combining it with the aims and the achievements of the Museum of Comparative Zoology here. Let me just say a couple things about this, not the collection, but the MCZ generally. The Museum of Comparative Zoology has the largest collection of organisms of all kinds of any private institution. We are at the level and the rank of the American Museum of Natural History, of the Field Museum at Chicago, the National Museum of Natural History at the Smithsonian, and the Museum of Natural History in London. We are in the front line, and we have, therefore, here at Harvard, a tremendous future, both in basic research and in education, as Brian Farrell has stressed. And I would then like to add final words on this. This is what I would have said if I had made it and had
Please.
and offered my
Our time is yours.
congratulations and introduction to you possibly. And that is this museum, this collection, now enhanced wonderfully in the most abundant and diverse group of insects of all, has a splendid future ahead of it in science and education. Now, that's been said, but let me add to it a bit, just a couple more words, and that is that the number of species on Earth, making all the ecosystems, the living world, our automatic support system, the number of species has been estimated as of all kinds at about 10 million, order of magnitude. The number of species that have been discovered to the present time of all kinds of organisms is just edged past 2 million, with scientific names and so on, 2 million, of which about 1 million are insects. This means that we have any knowledge whatsoever of only 20% of the species of organisms on Earth. And I'm talking about eukaryotic organisms, that is those above the level of bacteria and other microorganisms. They are even less well known. This is the place, one of those centers of future research and study where where this great gap will be filled. And it has to be filled because the rate at which the species are going extinct is right now estimated order of magnitude, but reliably in its immensity, between 100 and 1,000 times before the coming of humans. The rate at which all the organizations in the world devoted to conservation, the study of biodiversity and conservation, all these organizations in all the world have achieved at the present time to slow down the red list of endangered species. This is mostly knowledge from the vertebrates, but sure it would also accrue to insects and the other invertebrates, the little things that run the world, I like to call them. We have, with all our effort up to this point, slowed the descent of species that are on the endangered list into extinction by only 20%. So this leads, and I hope I'm not going on too long after, at any rate, the point is, this leads me to the future in which the study of biodiversity led here, among the leaders of which include the Museum of Comparative Zoology and our collections just described, to a major role in two huge advances in science on the horizon. First is to stop the mass extinctions of the world of species. We can do it, but we need to have a much greater and more detailed knowledge of every species on the planet. Now, if that doesn't satisfy the young who are looking for a great career and ambitious young researchers just starting out who would like to do great science, not just simple descriptive science, the second major event, the second big thing, is the analysis of ecosystems. Ecosystems are the most complex systems of which we have knowledge in the universities, human brain not accepted. The study of biodiversity has challenges to it that in substance and in theory whose solution will be big science, it will be great science, and that is why we need to push farther and ahead and faster. And with that, thank you very, very much, Ryan, for all you've done.
I'd like to welcome Eileen Rockefeller Grold and her spouse Paul Grold to the stage for a couple of moments. I believe they'd like to make a presentation.
This is completely unscheduled and unanticipated, but I want to say thank you, Brian, and for your team at Harvard for creating a home for this collection, and the best home possible, obviously. And one of these slides that you showed was a trip that we took as a family to Botswana when in 2007. And as a result of that trip, we presented this to David the following Christmas in 2008. And it's an atlas beetle, but a particularly atlas beetle that was made by an artist who inserts a mechanical, I'll show it to you. It's
wow.
A clockwork-like mechanical interior of it. And for me, the beauty of this is that it's giving an additional argument, additional reason for what Ed Wilson just said about why we not only must protect the biodiversity that exists out there, but why we must use collections like these to learn more about the intricacies of the workings of the natural world that have such deep impact on us. And one way that that's happening today is with self-driving cars and robotics, which insects in their living systems are being used in depth and studied in depth to bring those technologies to humanity. So I want to give this to you. It belonged to David Rockefeller, and as a appreciation for all you've done and all you will continue to do here at Harvard and for the world.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Eileen. Very wonderful. Thank you for coming. Thank you both for being here.